Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into what we call the economics of grace. We're going to unpack the parable of the vineyard. It's a 2,000-year-old story, but let me tell you, it completely flips our modern understanding of fairness right on its head.
So let me ask you, are you keeping score in life? Maybe at the office or at home or even in your own spiritual journey. Just imagine you've put in years of hard work, loyalty, blood, sweat, and tears. And then, out of nowhere, someone who just showed up at the literal last minute gets handed your exact same reward. How does that make you feel? Stings a little, right? Kind of feels completely unfair. Well, that instinctive desire for recognition, that gut-level demand for fairness, that's the emotional core of what we're unpacking today.
Let's actually kick things off with a super relatable modern example from our source material. There's this guy, a participant named Matt, who shared a recent situation from his office, and honestly, it is so easy to feel his frustration here. Basically, Matt does the heavy lifting at work. He stepped in, fixed this massive problem, poured in all this extra effort, and built brand new processes just to get a project back on track. But when it came time for the praise to be handed out, the very people who caused the original mess were included in the recognition. Yeah. Matt admitted he felt a massive wave of resentment and, frankly, entitlement. He actually caught himself thinking, wait, I did all the heavy lifting. I deserve more. So instead of just celebrating a win for the whole team, he found himself nursing his ego. And you know what's wild? This everyday modern frustration perfectly mirrors the parable of the vineyard from Matthew chapter 20. So Jesus tells this story about a landowner who desperately needs workers. He goes out at dawn, hiring the first group and agreeing to pay them a standard daily wage. Simple enough, right? But he doesn't stop there. He goes out again at the 3rd hour, then the 6th hour, the 9th hour, and finally at the 11th hour, literally right before quitting time. He finds more people just standing idle because nobody had hired them yet. So he sends them all into the vineyard to work. Now, the real punchline of this whole story hits when evening falls and it's time to get paid. The landowner tells his steward to pay the workers, but he says to start with the very last ones hired and move backward to the first. And the payment? Exactly 1 denarius for every single person. No way, right? The guy who worked maybe 1 hour in the cool evening breeze got the exact same coin as the guy who had been breaking his back under the scorching sun since dawn. So the absolutely crucial point here is how those early workers reacted. When they saw the latecomers get a full day's wage, they naturally assumed, hey, we're going to get more. But they didn't. They got exactly what they agreed to up front. Immediately, they start murmuring and grumbling. They're complaining, the last one worked 1 hour and you have made them equal to us, who bore the whole burden of the day and scorched the heat. Now, notice something really important here. An actual injustice didn't even occur. They were paid a completely fair, agreed-upon wage. But their initial contentment was instantly poisoned the second they started comparing themselves to others. Envy crept right in. It's a psychological trap, and we fall into it all the time. Our source material gives this fantastic real-world example to put it in perspective. Imagine a guy who gets a $100 bonus at work. He is thrilled, high satisfaction, telling everyone how happy he is. But the very second he finds out a coworker got a $200 bonus, instant discontentment. He's suddenly miserable. If he had never known about that other guy, he would have stayed perfectly happy. We're so often the source of our own misery just because we literally cannot stop comparing our situation to everyone else's. To really grasp this, we've got to look at why this parable was told in the first place. The context is huge here. Jesus was actually responding directly to his disciple Peter. In the previous chapter, Matthew 19, Peter was aggressively keeping score. You can kind of picture him raising his hand like the ultimate teacher's pet, pointing out that he and the disciples had left absolutely everything to follow Jesus first. So, naturally, they should expect a bigger reward, right? Jesus uses this vineyard story to gently but very firmly correct Peter's assumption that spiritual rewards are handed out based on seniority or, the amount of sweat equity you put in. And that brings us to the core conflict, the commercial mindset versus God's economy. As the source material points out, we are fundamentally wired like business people. Our logic says, I do this work, I get paid this amount. It's all about works, human fairness, entitlement, the law, keeping a really strict ledger. But God's economy, it operates on a totally different axis. It's built on unmerited grace, radical generosity, and equality according to His good pleasure. The divine simply isn't bound by our transactional tit-for-tat commercial framework. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, it's incredibly humbling.
A lifelong follower of faith doesn't get some special VIP pass or extra access or a bigger mansion than the 11th hour believer who finds faith literally on their deathbed. Just like Matt shouldn't have expected more praise than his coworkers for fixing the office problem, longtime believers shouldn't expect a different standing than a brand new convert. We all end up on the exact same level ground of grace. Instead of feeling envious, the source argues we should be throwing a massive celebration every single time a new person joins the fold, no matter how late in the day it is. But let's take this a step further, because the parables in Matthew constantly start with the phrase, "the kingdom of heaven is like." And as the source material discusses, the kingdom of heaven isn't just some faraway destination you wait to go to after you die. It is defined as living right now, in the present moment, in the fellowship and presence of Christ, where our will is fully aligned with God's will. It's an active, daily reality, and we can step right into it the moment we decide to let go of our obsessive need to keep score.
We can really see how this builds through another brilliant little example from the text, the parable of the yeast. Back in Matthew 13, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a woman who takes a tiny bit of yeast and mixes it into roughly 60 pounds of flour. Now, 60 pounds is a lot of dough, but that tiny bit of yeast eventually permeates and transforms the entire massive batch. The source material beautifully compares this yeast to daily, unceasing prayer. Just a little bit of constant prayerful recognition acts exactly like that yeast, slowly transforming us into real kingdom dwellers right here on earth.
So what does it actually look like to be a kingdom dweller today? How do we stop being those disgruntled, grumbling early workers in the vineyard? Well, the source highlights some highly practical ways to experience this reality here and now. It happens when you engage in something like prison ministry, or when you sit down and just genuinely show kindness to an isolated, lonely person in a nursing home. You experience it in the simple, everyday practices of gentleness, patience, and forgiveness. And, this is absolutely crucial, you live in it when you actively choose to let go of that 8-to-5 corporate ego drama. That exhausting anxiety of always needing to prove you're the best and deserve the most credit. Pair that with constant, unceasing prayer, and everything shifts.
Let's circle all the way back to the landowner's response to those angry, envious workers. He looks right at them and asks, "Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with what is mine? Or is your eye evil because I am good?" Wow, that is a massive wake-up call. It reminds us that whenever we get upset that someone else is receiving grace or blessings that we feel we worked harder for, we're actually operating from a really prideful mentality. We end up judging radical goodness through our own narrow, flawed lens of human accounting. Which brings us to our final and perhaps most provocative thought of this explainer. When we get all wrapped up in comparing our efforts to everyone else's, we really have to stop and ask ourselves a hard question. Do we actually want God's fairness? Because true, strict fairness without any mercy, that's kind of a terrifying prospect. Or do we really just want His grace? By dropping our commercial mindsets and that endless, exhausting need to keep score, we can finally stop nursing our egos and just be grateful for the incredible, unearned gift we've all been given. Definitely something to chew on the next time you find yourself wanting to take all the credit. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.